What's up everyone, welcome to another YouTube video. In this video I will explain to you guys how to solve chess puzzles. Solving chess puzzles is extremely important for your chess improvement because whether or not you spot a tactic can decide whether you win the game or not. I often get a lot of questions from people, how do I get from let's say 1600 to 1800 or 1800 to 2000, but my answer is always do a lot of puzzles. I think it's the best way to improve your results. Once again, whether you spot tactics or not really decides the game. So let's go to chess.com and let's start a session here in Puzzle Rush. As you guys can see, my highest score in Puzzle Rush Survival is 206. It's the highest video recorded Puzzle Rush Survival score ever. I also have the longest streak, which is like 195. But once again, in this video, I'll explain to you guys how you can get a high score. So we select survival and let's click play. Okay, so just wait for the session to start. And before we start, if you solve puzzles, there's a few things you have to keep in mind. And this is not only when you do puzzles, but this is also when you actually play a game. When you are solving puzzles or when you're playing a game of chess, the most important things to keep in mind are checks, captures, and attacks. And we'll go over them one by one. So let's get started. Here we see we are in a check. So there's a couple ways you can get out of a check. You can move your king, or you can capture the piece that's giving a check. So in this case we can capture the rook, and that's obviously the solution. Let's go ahead and take the rook. Takes king h7 is the only move. I mean queen f8 loses a queen, so let's go here. He goes, so we move on to the next puzzle. Alright, so here we see my eye is immediately drawn to this king that's kind of stuck, right? There's a pawn here, but our pawn here is holding both these squares. So is there a way to check the king? And yes, there is. We have rook to g8 check. Black can block, but we just take, and that's checkmate. Now, once again, we see that the king is kind of stuck behind these pawns. It has this square, but this square is also covered by our rook. So we immediately start thinking, is there a check? And yes, there is. We have rook e1, checkmate. And the most important reason why you have to look for checks is because, well, it can be checkmate. Now in this puzzle, we see we're down a bishop, so we want to look for something to counterattack. In this case, we see that we can take the pawn on g2, the king can stop back. Is there a way to follow up? Well, let's just go one step at a time. Yes, we can give another check, the king goes there. This would just be a repetition, but once again, we'll look for checks because it can be checkmate. So we go rook here. Now, our opponent goes knight to c3. Do we have a check that's good? Well, there's queen f1. That's checkmate, so let's go for that. Our opponent takes the pawn here. Now, is there a check that we have? Yes, we can take the pawn on f7. Our opponent's king goes there. Now, once again, we see that this king is stuck behind these pawns. So we want to, if we see that the opponent's king is stuck behind the pawns, we want to be thinking of a back rank checkmate. Are there any checks? We can take the rook, but the queen would recapture and defend the square, but we can give a check, and if the rook takes, we have rook takes f8, checkmate. So we give a check and checkmate. Alright, we move on. Now this is a different kind of puzzle, but we have these far advanced pawns, so obviously it would have to be queening the pawn. That has to be the best move. And we also give a check, and we would change off the queens, and then we can push this other pawn. So let's queen, takes, we recapture. Now we just have to keep pushing our pawn. This is another rule, by the way, in endgames, often you have to be looking at pushing your pawn. So here we push our pawn and get a queen. Alright, so we keep going. In this puzzle we're down a knight, so we have to look for something to go for a counterattack. Do we have any checks? We see that the king is a bit exposed, this bishop is covering these squares here, but we have this check here, so we know that that has to be the correct move. So we can just go ahead and play it. And after our opponent plays this move, we can think what we're going to do. So he goes king f8. Do we have any checks? Now we can go queen here, but he goes king here, and we don't have a follow-up, right? Because this is covered. But we do have queen check here, and if he blocks, we just take. And if he blocks with knight, we also take. And we have a lot of checks to follow up, so it feels like that should end in a checkmate. Once again, if your opponent's king is exposed, ideally you want to look for a sequence that's check, 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 and mate. Right, so here we give a check, we take the bishop, and we take the knight, we give a check here, and we give checkmate. right? Just keep looking for checks. Now in this position, we see that the king is kind of stuck. This knight is holding these two squares, so is there a way to check the king? Well, we have this check, and isn't that just giving up a queen? Well, we take again, the king is hit by a check, the bishop also covers this square, so that's checkmate. So let's give a check, let's recapture the bishop, and there we go. Once again, we're down, in this puzzle we're down a lot of material, we're down in exchange and 2 pawns. So I want to be looking for a counterattack. We see that we have this check, king would have to move over, it's stuck behind these pawns, and we should be familiar with this pattern of giving a check, our opponent's rook would take, and we take, and that's checkmate. So let's go ahead and take, let's give a check, and recapture with the rook with checkmate. Alright, so, okay, we see that the opponent's king is here, and we see that we have the queen and the rook lined up. So immediately my eye is drawn to this move, queen takes h7. The king can step over, but then, once again, the king is kind of stuck behind these pieces, so then we have checkmate. These puzzles are fairly simple, but I'm still trying to explain my thought process. I've of course solved a lot of puzzles in my life, so I could go through these very quickly, but I hope that these explanations make sense and help you solve these puzzles. So let's play checkmate. Alright, so let's have a look here. We see that we're playing with white, and we see that our opponent is trying to push these pawns down the board. So there's really only one move white can play, and that's bishop to g2. We have to stop black from going f1 queen. So if this was a game or a puzzle, I would not spend any time here, and I would just block the pawn. So we go bishop f1. Now our opponent's king is hitting this pawn, so we know we kind of have to push our own pawn. You can go king to e3, but we keep pushing. If he goes king e2, we keep pushing. Once again, this is an endgame. Pushing your pawns is really the most important thing. So let's just push. Let's push. Let's keep pushing. Let's take the queen and make our own queen. Okay. Now here we're playing with black, and we see that we're down a rook for a queen. But we see that our opponent's king and the queen are on the same line. So my eye is immediately drawn to the move rook d8 check. And remember I was talking to checks earlier, right? Like you have to be looking at checks, but this check is especially good because it's not only a check, it's also an attack. That's why I put these 3 things down in order. So we know that rook d8 has to be the move, and now we take the queen. Once again, this is an endgame, so what do? We push our pawn, we push our pawn, we push our pawn, and make a queen. Alright, now here we're down a lot of material. White has a knight, white is up a knight and a bishop, but we see that the king is exposed, so I immediately start looking for checks. Is there anything? Well, there's queen to d2, that looks pretty good. If the king steps back, is there a follow-up? Queen f2 checkmate. You can block with the knight, but we just take, and it's going to be checkmate anyway. So let's give a check, take the knight, and checkmate. Okay, so we keep going. Now in this puzzle, we see that white has a queen, and we only have a knight in exchange for that. But we see that this king is kind of stuck, right? Our pawn is holding these 2 squares, and the king is stuck behind the rook and the queen. So we want to be looking for a check. Is there a check? Yes, there is. There's bishop b4 check. White can block. Now how do we take this knight? We can take with the bishop or with the pawn. Let's say we take with the pawn. White has king f2. This square frees up. So instead of that, we should take with the bishop. White has to give the queen. We take, and after that we have 2 knights. White is 1 bishop, so we're up a piece in the endgame. So let's take with the bishop and let's take the queen. Alright, we keep going. We're down a full knight here. We've seen this pattern before. Can we do something against the king? Yes, we can give a check. The king steps over, and we give a check here. The rook has to take, and that's checkmate. The king is once again stuck behind these pawns. So if you see that your opponent's king is stuck behind its own pawns, you always want to be looking for back rank checkmates. Alright. So in this position, material is fairly equal. I mean, we have a knight and a bishop, but black has a rook, right? But what you also want to be looking at in puzzles or in your own chess games is loose pieces. And in this situation, the rook on d8 is defended by the queen, but it could potentially be attacked by our queen and a rook on the d file. So we want to find a way to get the knight out of the way. And that's where we start looking at checks. And we see the move knight f6, checking the king. Black can take, but then we take the rook if black recaptures. We take with the rook once again, and we're up a full bishop. So let's give a check. Let's take the rook, and let's take the queen. So far so good. Now in this situation, we see that the king is castled. But we see that we have an open H file. And it would be really nice to open up that H file and potentially include the queen as well. So, but we see that the knight on f6 is guarding the square. So can we achieve both goals at the same time? And the answer is yes. We can sacrifice our bishop here, and if the knight recaptures, we have queen to h5. We create an attack on the knight, and if the knight were to move here, we have queen h8, checkmate. So let's go ahead and take with the bishop here, and if the knight recaptures, we have queen h5. This is a common pattern, by the way, from London openings. So if you solve a lot of puzzles, you will start spotting these tactics very quickly. Let's go here and take the knight. Alright, so let's keep going. Now, in this puzzle, do we have any checks? Yes, we do. We have bishop d4, we also have bishop b1. Now, let's think about these things again. Does white have any loose pieces? We see that the rook is loose, it's undefended, but we also see that the bishop is undefended. So that's where the move bishop e1 comes into play. We check the king, and if the king moves, we can pick up this bishop on h4, and we're up a bishop. So let's give a check and take the bishop. Alright. Here we see that our opponent's pawn is pretty far advanced, but we see that the king is a bit stuck. So, do we just have to stop the pawn, or can we go for a counterattack? Now we have to move check. Once again, check is on top of our list, so it's something we have to look at. And if the king stops back, do we have another check? I mean, the king is kind of stuck, right, with these pawns. Well, we have a check here. Our opponent can block, but that's checkmate. Let's go ahead and give a check, and checkmate. Okay, let's keep going. Now in this situation, we're down 2 rooks, but we see that we can take another rook with check. So that has to be the correct move. So let's just play that move and see what our opponent's gonna do. So we take these blocks. Now we see that the king is defending the rook, right? If we could somehow push the king away from the rook, that would be ideal. And that's where the move bishop c4 check comes to mind. If the king steps to the side, we're gonna take the rook with checkmate. So let's go ahead and give a check, take the bishop, and take the rook on f8. Alright. Now in this case, it looks a bit scary, right? Our opponent has a lot of pieces around our king, but we also see that the queen doesn't have a whole lot of squares, right? We see that the rook is covering a lot of squares along the g file. Our bishop is covering these squares. This square is protected by our bishop, and our bishop on e2 is defended by our queen. So I start thinking, hey, can I trap that queen somehow? And the queen can still go back along the f file. But if we go rook f1, we not only attack the queen, but we also stop the queen from going back. So rook f1 has got to be the correct move. So let's go here and recapture, and we win a queen. Alright. Now in this case, we see that our king is under a lot of pressure. Black's threatening checkmate here, he's threatening checkmate here, there's also b4. So we want to be looking for a counterattack. So do we have any checks? Right? So we see that the only legal check we have is queen takes g6. Okay, our opponent has to recapture. Do we have any follow-up checks? Yes, we can take. If the king steps here, do we have any follow-up checks? Well, we can go rook h1, but then our rook would get taken on g6. So we would have to go rook g7 first, and if the king steps up, then rook h1, and black's getting checkmated. He can block with the rook, but we take, and it's checkmate. So let's go ahead and go queen takes g6, take on g6 with the rook, give a check, and go rook h1, checkmate, and take the rook. Alright, so here we should ask ourselves the question, do we have any checks? Not really, right? So we start looking at it, at captures. And so we see that we can take this a pawn, right? And so the move that immediately comes to mind to my eye is the move rook takes a4. Because we not only attack the queen, but we also attack the bishop if the queen were to move, right? We create 2 attacks. So let's go ahead and go rook takes e4. We know it's got to be the correct move. Now our opponent goes bishop takes c2. So let's start considering captures. And when you are considering captures, you want to consider the highest value capture first. Right, so we should consider taking the queen first. It's the highest value capture. Now what is black going to do? Black can take the rook or the queen, but black should consider taking the queen because that's his highest value capture. Now after black takes our queen, what is our highest value capture? We can take the rook. We can take the bishop, but we can also take the rook. The rook is worth more. Black would have to recapture, and only then we take the bishop, and we are up a bishop, so white is winning. So let's go ahead and take the queen, and take the rook on b8, and take the bishop on d1. Alright, so here we're down a lot of material, so we start looking for checks. Is there a check we have? Well, we have this, but it gives us the queen. But there's queen c1. White goes bishop to d1. Do we have a follow-up check? Well, yes we do. We have rook e8. There's no way to block for white, so white would have to step the king over, and then we have queen takes d1. Checkmate. So we know that that's got to be the correct sequence. So let's go ahead and give a check, give another check, and take on d1. Alright, in this case we're down a rook and a bishop, so we want to, but we see that the king is kind of exposed, so we want to be looking once again for a sequence that's check, check, and mate. Do we have any checks? Yes, we do. We have check. The king only squares king of 7. Then we have another check here. Black and block. And do we have a follow-up check? Yes, we do. We have queen h7. We want to keep the rook on the 8th rank because it's covering these squares here. And the queen covers the squares on the 7th rank. So let's go ahead and give a check. Give a check and checkmate. Okay. So in this case we see we're down an exchange. But we see that the king is kind of stuck. Because the bishop is covering this square and it's covering this square. So if we could somehow get a rook to the first rank and give a check, that would be pretty good. So the move I start looking at is rook a8. Because the c and b file are blocked by white's pawns. But with rook a8 we want to go rook a1. Give a check, and even if white were to move the rook, we can still pick up the rook on g1. So rook a8 looks like a good move. And we sort of attack the a1 square, if that makes sense. So we go rook a8, rook to b2. Let's go ahead and give a check. And if the king steps up, we take the rook on g1. Let's give a check, and I take the rook on g1. Alright. So here we see we're down a lot of material. White is a queen and a knight for a rook only. But we see that this king is kind of exposed. Right, our bishop is covering a lot of squares on this diagonal. We also have this bishop. So let's start looking for checks. We have two checks. We have check here and we have rook e1. Okay, if we go bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, we can go rook e1, but white can just block. So if something doesn't work, right, if you feel like you have the right idea but it doesn't work, sometimes changing the moves around can help. So here's where the move rook e1 comes to mind. White can take, but then we take on f3. The bishop is covering the g1 square and white's king is getting checkmated. If after rook e1 white were to step the king up, we have rook g1. The bishop is holding this square. The rook is defended by the bishop, so that's also checkmate. So let's go ahead and give a check. Alright, bishop f1 doesn't do much. We just take and checkmate. Alright, so here this position is looking kind of scary. Black is threatening check and checkmate on the h-file. But this king is kind of exposed. So is there something we can do against the king? Do we have a check? Right, by now you should be asking yourself that question. And we have the move rook takes c4. What can black do? Black can take the rook. Right, do we have a follow-up? Well, we can take the pawn with a check. The king's only square is here. And then we have checkmate. Because we want to hold this square and this square from the king. So we know the rook takes c4 has to be the correct move. He recaptures, we take, and now we go queen f4 checkmate. Alright, so we keep going. Now, do we have any checks? Not, I mean, I can take here, but that just hangs the queen. So do I have any captures? Okay, I can take here. That's my highest value capture, so it's a move I have to consider. And once again, does black have any loose pieces? We see that this rook on f6 is undefended, so you also want to start thinking about that. So if we take on c5 and black recaptures, we can give a check here. We check the king on c5 and we also attack this rook over here. So we feel like we know that that has to be the solution. So let's go ahead and take here and give a check and take the rook. Okay, so we've passed 30. Puzzles were fairly easy. They're getting a bit more difficult now, but still pretty doable. Now, we're down a rook in the endgame. We just have to take the rook. If you're playing a game here or solving a puzzle, there's no need to waste time here, so let's just go ahead and take it. So our opponent goes a5. And in pawn and games, there's a little rule, and it's called the rule of the square. Right, when a pawn is trying to push forward, you can draw a little square like this. Like here, 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 and here. And if you want to stop that pawn, your king has to be inside of that square. Right, so if you want, we can go king to d6, and we step inside the square. Right, because if we go h5, white's going to push, and if we push, white's going to push, and if we push, white queens first. So we know that that cannot be correct. But we can go king d6, and if a6, king c7, yes, the rule of the square holds true. We do stop the pawn. So let's go king d6, goes king to b2, and here we see, you know, is white's king in our square, right? Let's draw, we can also draw a square here. But we see that the king is not, it's still in b2. So, but if we waste the move with king here, then the king would step inside the square. So we know we have to push our pawn right away. So let's go ahead and push. Let's push. Let's push. We make sure that the king is not on time, so we just push once again and make a new queen. Alright, so far so good. Now, here we don't really have any checks. But do we have any captures? Well, we can take this rook on f6. We don't really want to take with the queen, because then we lose the queen. But we see that we can take with the rook. Alright, so let's start looking at black's captures. So black can recapture this rook, or he can take the rook on b1. Right? In both cases he's capturing a rook. The value of the capture would be equal, so we have to consider both moves seriously. Let's say he takes the rook on b1 and gives a check. Alright, that should be the first move you're thinking about, because it's a capture with a check. What is our best response? Well, we can actually block and give a check at the same time. So if black moves the king, then we take the queen. So we know that that line is good for us. Let's say black recaptures on f6. Do we have a way? Because we have a pin here. And if you have a pin, you generally want to increase the pressure on the piece that is pinned. Now our rook is still under attack, so the move rook f1 is a move that my eye is drawn to directly. And black simply cannot defend this rook. You can go queen f5, but we just take that rook and we win a queen for rook. So that's a very good trade. So let's go ahead and take and go rook to f1 and take the queen. Okay. Now, in this case, we see that the queen is on the same line as this rook. So if we could somehow get the bishop out of the way, we get a pin. But once we have that pin, we want to start looking for a way to attack this knight on e4. Right, so we could also consider f5, hitting the knight, and if the knight moves, we have, you know, a check here. But if we go f5, white can preemptively block the check with knight f2, so this is no longer a check. So we see that that does not work, so let's try to change the moves around again. So let's start looking at bishop c5. If white goes king g2 or king h1, then we go f5. Not only is the knight pinned to the queen, but it's also pinned to the king. Alright, so after bishop c5, white can also block like this. But in that case, we exchange, and then we go f5. Once again, you want to put pressure on a piece that is pinned. The knight cannot move because that would lose white the queen on e3. So we know that that has to be the solution. So let's go bishop c5, king g2, and now we put pressure on the pinned piece and pick up the knight. Alright, so here we're in endgame. We have an extra bishop, but these pawns are pretty dangerous. So let's start looking for a way that we could potentially pick up those pawns. So we can take here, and as soon as white recaptures, we see that the king is on the same diagonal as these pawns on g5 and h6. So let's see if there's a way to take advantage. Well, we have check, and if the king steps forward, we can take this pawn here. Now white can go h5, h7, can't talk anymore. But then we have bishop f6. Carving the square, we're up a bishop, and black's winning. So let's go ahead and take here, give a check, take the pawn, and take this pawn over here. Alright, so far so good. Okay, so we see here, our king is under a lot of pressure. Black's taking it with a queen, a knight, and another knight. So it would be nice to get rid of some of black's pieces, right? We want to take here, but we see that that's defended by the queen and the bishop, so we see that we cannot do that. But very often when you're solving a puzzle, or when you're playing a game, you should ask yourself, what do I want to do? And in this case, we want to take on g4. But we see the problem, right? The problem is that it's defended by the queen and the bishop. So then you start thinking, is there a way I can solve that problem? And if you start thinking like that, then the move rook f8 comes to mind immediately. Black can go king e7, we can take here, and black can recapture, but then we take this knight here. If black takes here, we take on g4. But while I'm saying that, I realize that that is pretty dangerous, because in that case black could recapture on c8, and our king is pretty exposed, so black would follow up with rook to g8. So rook f8 is a move we have to consider, but our first thought is not always correct. Right, we see that the knight on g4 is also pinned to the queen. And when we have a pin, we want to put pressure on the piece that is pinned, so that's where the move h3 comes to mind. Black can go knight at f6, but we can just take that knight, because our queen on d1 is defended, and white stays up a rook. So let's go pawn at h3, goes queen g6, but in this case we just take the knight, and we're up a rook. Alright, so we keep moving on. Here we see that white's up a lot of material. He's up a knight and a bishop, and another knight. Or wait, actually, he's up 2 bishops and a knight. But we see that the king is kind of exposed. So do we have any checks? Well, we have a check here, but the queen can take, and I can take here, right? That's our other check, queen takes d4. But as soon as we do that, white is king f1 and his king is kind of safe. So we see that that does not work. Let's try to change the moves around. So we have this move queen takes d4, white can recapture, and then we have rook e1. The knight is holding this square, so that's checkmate. So let's go ahead and take the knight. Well, often blocking does not work. We just take, and if the king steps over, then we have checkmate. Let's go ahead and take and checkmate. Alright, so let's see here. Do we have any captures? Well, we can take the rook. That's our highest value capture, something we should consider. And we see that as soon as white recaptures, this rook on e2 is undefended, so this knight is pinned, it cannot move. So is there a way we can put pressure on the pinned piece? Yes, there is. We have f6, and if the knight takes here, we take the rook on e2, we win in exchange. So that's a very good trade. So let's go ahead and take, and go f6, and now take the knight. Now in this case, once again, black is up a full bishop, but his king is exposed. So do we have any checks? And when we're considering checks, we should consider where the king can go. In this case, the king can only go to these 2 squares. So is there a way we can take away one of those squares? Well, if we go bishop e8, we take away this square, and the king is forced to step to g8. Now, do we have a follow-up? Well, we have queen takes d5, check the king. The bishop can block what we take, and that's checkmate. So let's go ahead and give a check. Take here and checkmate. Okay, so we keep moving on. We're down 2 rooks. Is there a check here? The only check we have is here. If white goes back, do we have a follow-up? Well, we want to keep the queen here because it's covering a lot of squares, but we have knight e2 checkmate. If the knight were to go here, we can take with our bishop. That diagonal is no longer blocked, and if the king goes here, we can take the knight, and if the king goes here, we have a checkmate on e2. So let's go ahead and give a check. Take on b3. Alright, we have knight e2, but our knight would be standing in the way of our queen there. So we have to give a check with the queen, because we want to take with the queen here, and that's how we get the checkmate. Alright, so let's have a look here. This king is kind of stuck. We have a lot of pieces around black's king. We see that we have a check, because that would open up the line of our queen to the rook. But let's see what would happen. Black can take, so we take the rook, the king steps up. Do we have a follow-up? We have a check, the king goes here. We have another check, the king goes here, and our knight is hit. So, ideally we want to save the knight and also check the king. So that's where we have a check, and if the king goes here, we have knight d4, checking the king, and picking up the queen on f3. So we see that the puzzles are already getting very complicated. So let's give a check here. Take the rook, give a check, give another check, and we would win the queen on the next move. Well, since the puzzles were getting pretty complicated, I'm gonna stop here. Solving the first 40 is pretty doable, in my humble opinion. Just takes a bit of practice. Now, if you enjoy these puzzles and you want to do as many puzzles as you like, you can consider upgrading your Chess.com membership. The link is in the description. My affiliate link is go.chess.com/Bok. Check it out, try to solve some puzzles. Let me know in the comments below what your highest Puzzle Rush survival score is, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Alright, bye guys.